So the TPP is a free trade deal between a dozen countries in the Pacific. It's largely been promoted by the United States as a trade agreement that would span both some economically developing countries and several of the economically developed or more industrialized states. It does exclude China, and part of the thinking some people have is that there are political motives behind this trade agreement.
The release of the full text I felt like was very strategic, because before the only actual, kind of direct primary source of it was coming from WikiLeaks. And their analysis, and the analysis that like several news outlets did from that, was that only six of the sections actually dealt with the terms of the tariffs, whereas the other 22 or 23, I think it was, were more like hidden provisions that were maybe having to do with like patents and what you were...
Or related, yeah. That's a trend that we've seen though in a number of different fora or negotiating arenas. And it says something about the appeal of trade agreements, that because people feel those are very important, other issues that are brought to the table are not being dealt with separately or in their own realm. They're being brought into the trade agreements because that also provides a link for enforcement. If everyone feels like they have this shared mutual benefit through trade, then the other sort of side agreements get not just pushed to the table where the differences get resolved and then written into the agreement, but also then there's some kind of mechanism for making sure everyone abides by that compromise, or what we think are likely to be compromises in those agreements.
There's been a lot of criticism coming from various groups on the left and right, but mostly from the left, I would say. And one of the things that definitely unites them, they oppose it for different reasons, but one of the things I find is very common in the opposition is the issue of the investor-state settlement disputes and how it infringes upon national sovereignty. If you want to explain also to maybe what that is to people that don't.
It's difficult. The rules, I don't actually know the specifics of what's in the TPP on this particular issue in terms of how they may vary from rules that are already in place. The United States and Canada with NAFTA already have some of these rules in operation, and so that may govern a huge part of what we're talking about here with these international investment disputes that are possible. The area where the TPP most likely will have the biggest effect on this is much more with countries that are on the other side of this economically developing versus economically developed divide. So this may change the position that American and Canadian and Australian firms have if they're doing business in countries like Brunei or Vietnam that are also signees on the TPP, because that's where it's going to change the procedures most likely by a great deal. There are certainly some criticisms about how this works in terms of changing the abilities of governments to regulate what's going on in their economies, but I think often the fears are easily overplayed on that. So that is just my own take on it without a whole lot of knowledge.
Obviously, there are rational reasons why states choose to become parts of these agreements. It's just the issue I think people have is with this investor-state settlement dispute clause that's as part of the TPP is who exactly gets to determine the regulation standards. I've heard a uniting thing is that people do not like the idea of a corporation being able to say to a government that you can't put a regulation that will hurt our profit. Yeah, because it's the profit motive behind it rather than the labor regulations that are supposed to be a part of international.
Right. Well, it's interesting. Last thing you mentioned is labor regulations, because there are parts of the TPP which presumably, if they get enforced, this is always one of the questions, presumably will actually raise some of the labor standards in some of the other countries. The general point you're putting out there, though, is that this kind of clause in this treaty does impinge on the ability of governments to introduce some new forms of regulation on sectors where you're going to start to see international investors resist that regulation. So there is a calculation on that. Again, you can look and see whether the deal between Canada and the United States with NAFTA has necessarily created lots of different conflicts over this or not. There's definitely been some conflicts. International lawyers make money out of this. Career opportunities for students. I wouldn't necessarily expect that you would see a lot of different new conflicts between corporations and governments out of this, but it does depend on what sort of regulations governments want to try to introduce. So.
It does definitely stem from who participated in the negotiations in the first place. It was the states, and I believe there were something like 500 corporate trade advisors was the word that they used on the negotiation process. Well, that's something that I feel is a very valid criticism on the pharmaceutical issue, because beyond the length of patents, it also allows pharmaceutical corporations to be able to have a lot more leeway in determining their own prices. And it was not all, but most of the pharmaceutical companies that were a part of these negotiations were coming from the United States, and I believe there were a few in Western Europe.
Well, most pharmaceutical companies these days that are doing serious drug development are multinationals. So their research tends to be based in some countries, obviously the more economically advanced countries, so Western Europe, the United States, Canada to a lesser extent. Canada's actually lost some of that in the last 10 years or so. Australia as well. And so the interesting thing was those countries, even amongst themselves, didn't have similar standards on the length of the patent protection that goes with drug development. And I think a lot of people expected the longer time frame, which was the American position, would either prevail because the US would insist on it, or that there would be a compromise that would be closer to some of the in-between. So the differences that we've been looking at here were that the United States rules, I believe, emphasize a 12-year length of time where the information about how a new drug is manufactured is held secret. And the Canadian position was 8 years, the Australian position was 5 years, and obviously countries that aren't developing the drugs would like it to be even less than 5 years, because they're primarily interested in being either generic producers or just consumers of these, and so having generic producers elsewhere would be to their advantage. And so the issue was sort of, well, where would you predict this to work out? Is it going to be closer to the American position? Is it going to be a compromise, so somewhere like the Canadian position? And it turns out that it's actually the Australian position of 5 years, so a compromise amongst the overall group, but then a movement away from that longer time frame that the United States had proposed.
But admittedly, pharmacology is a much different industry than something like a luxury good, like a car coming from Japan or something like that. These are products that people are worried they'll be priced out of to get the necessary treatment that they need. Not just, especially in developing countries, but also low-income consumers in the United States and Canada and other industrialized nations.
Right, but you should remember the rule governs the development of new products. So it's less about what happens with how the manufacturing of the drugs takes place after they've been developed. So you're right that this affects how quickly new drugs get out to the marketplace and how long the originator of the drug gets a monopoly position to charge those super high prices. So obviously the shorter time spent is always good for consumers.
It speaks more to a moral obligation, I feel like, on the issue of pharmacology, because obviously the corporations have rational reasons for pursuing the length of the agreements that they wanted. But we have to maybe ask ourselves why there wasn't more of like a public involvement, at least on this particular issue, on something that was going to affect public health.
Well, I'm going to argue against that, and there's probably a good place that you can go and look online with the Brookings Institution, where they have a nice argument about why the American practice is the way it is. If the governments themselves want to be the ones who are doing the drug research and development, then, which there's a very good argument to make for that position, then, definitely you're starting off saying that drug development and the marketing of the drugs is a social responsibility, and that's how you're going to address it. It's not the way we do it in Canada. It's not the way it's done in the United States. We leave it as a private market incentive for corporations to develop these things. Mm-hmm. There's good and bad things about that, most definitely, right? Because that means certain kinds of diseases. So we can think about the little blue pill, Viagra, whatever, as one of these examples. The diseases that the companies see as a marketing opportunity are the ones that get focused on. So there's a problem right from the get-go with this more capitalist model. But if you're going to rely on the companies to do that research through competition, then they also be. So where do we strike that balance between that social responsibility that you're talking about, but the corporate motive that we're relying on to actually draw together the capital and the expertise to come up with the drugs? And so there's a point to defend some time period of monopoly profit for developing, because often there is a very long research and development pipeline that's very expensive for these companies to engage in. And so if they're not promised some kind of profit at the end, then they're not going to engage in that kind of research activity. So I would push back and say there is a good reason to go with that model, and it has worked fairly well. The question is, how long should that time span at the end be, and where do you strike that balance between the private corporations' motives and the potential gains for them, and that public responsibility and the desire to see the drug actually get out and be used by people who need it at a fair price. If you can promote these things in these rival states, that too will then be a really important draw for foreign capital and can make an important difference.
The unabashedly protectionist arguments obviously only go so far, but the validity of the transparency behind it, or the lack thereof, especially because we're talking about different countries with vastly different political systems and how much influence civil society groups had on these negotiations. And even in the U.S., which most people would think of as a pretty advanced democracy, Obama has tried to push a fast-track authority to put this bill through Congress, and there was literally no negotiations whatsoever in terms of the general public or the
anyone having any specific knowledge about what's in the details.
And the labor unions definitely have pushed back hard on this particularly.
Yeah, they've pushed back. I think the problem with asking for lots of transparency while negotiations are going on, when you are trying to link up a number of different issues, makes those negotiations much harder. It's much harder to do the sort of conceding in one area to get gains in another if every little offer is being scrutinized. So the danger is, if you go with much greater transparency, is that you will not be able to achieve too many of these agreements in practice, because almost always there is some kind of give and take.
Well, perhaps there could have been some labor union advisors, as there were hundreds of
corporate
trade
there could have been.
advisors.
Believe me, the politicians are thinking about where votes and other things are when they're making these decisions. So, what we would typically see is something like we actually did see in Canada, where the groups that were feeling like they were threatened by issues that had been made public or areas they knew where there were negotiations going on, like the dairy farmers and the auto parts sector. Either the government said they were going to stick to a certain position, which they didn't necessarily on the auto parts manufacturing from what it now appears, or they came up with some method of compensating groups, which is what happened with the dairy producers here in Canada. And it wouldn't be surprising to see some of that same kind of balancing out of political interests in the United States and in the other democracies that are part of this, because that is part of this ratification procedure. Either you take pressures from the domestic side and you settle with them in some fashion, or you go back and try to alter parts of the treaty.